Can I be self-indulgently autobiographical for a second? Thanks. I remember me and my dad stumbling upon this new show in the early 2000s while flipping through channels. We were hooked from the first episode we saw, about this guy who killed his boss at a dinner party and then became a Renaissance knight. It was a bit wacky, but it was also really funny. We watched more episodes over the next few nights. One was about a baby who flies into his dad's balls to kill all the sperm. It kind of became a minor bonding thing for me and my dad, especially since I was quite young and the jokes were not entirely age appropriate. It was like a coming of age thing. Anyway, we decided we wanted to see more of the show without waiting for the scheduled airing and sitting through the adverts, because that was a thing in the early 2000s. Instead, we bought the first 3 seasons of this show on DVD and binged it, foreshadowing the way that all TV shows would be watched in 2 decades' time. Except, with physical media, so better. Turns out at this time the show had been cancelled after just those 3 seasons, but favourable DVD sales convinced Fox to revive the show in 2004. You're welcome. However, the revived show was different, and how we came to stop annually purchasing those DVDs and gave up on the show entirely is a story in itself. But for now, I want to look at what made those first 3 seasons great. I want to look at what Family Guy did differently. The beating heart of any sitcom lies in its characters, and it's probably what a lot of people think of when considering how the early seasons of Family Guy stand out. Let's start with Cleveland. I'm getting the boring characters out of the way early. Right, anyway. Now let's talk about Quagmire. Because the show is quite adult in general, he doesn't stand out right away. I mean, the first episode starts with them all watching a porno together, but he quickly becomes established as a ladies' man. This isn't immediately sinister, but eventually we do come to see him as a full-on, jackpot. Also, they establish in the early seasons that he has a creepy obsession with Lois. Interestingly, the very first episode they introduce this comes directly after an episode where Brian realizes he has feelings for her. My theory is that they decided they wanted Brian to seem sympathetic, so they introduced Quagmire's less savoury obsession with Lois, so Brian would seem better by comparison. Although I guess Quagmire didn't get the memo.
You constantly hit on your best friend's wife.
Next there's Joe. You probably already know the story here. Joe used to be a badass character, whereas nowadays he's decidedly the punching bag of Peter's friend group. This is quite the fall from grace. In his first episode, the main focus is how he is so much better than Peter, and Peter gets jealous. Also, Bonnie is attracted to Joe without much ambiguity in these early seasons. That's not going to last long, sadly. Despite how different he is here, there are some signs for where the character was going. Firstly, they show him as being incredibly good-natured, which is initially part of why he's popular and well-liked, but it also makes him appear kind of weak when he's being nice to somebody who's making fun of him.
Look at me, I'm Joe! My legs don't work, but I make up for it by having a very strong upper body.
Well, I do say that.
Also, right towards the end of season 3, we get several examples where Joe's misery about his disability is played for laughs. Joe is at some points presented as very dominant and masculine, which gives him an appearance of strength. However, it's not hard to instead imagine that he's compensating for being disabled with his macho attitude. I guess they decided Joe secretly being weak and pathetic would be funnier. But even in the early episodes that push Joe around a bit, it's still quite dignified for him. In the big spotlight episode for his disability, it starts off with him being sad about it, but he ends up winning a sports competition and the focus switches to Peter being resentful of Joe's success, just like that first episode. These early seasons were a good time to be Joe. The early seasons also introduced a lot of the secondary characters who contribute to the comedy. With somebody like Mayor West, they hit the ground running with how to make him work in the show. It's surprising they didn't utilize him that much early on, honestly. Also, I wrote Evil Monkey in my notes. I guess he counts as a recurring character. And finally, we can't forget Herbert. Or, as he was known in my house growing up, the muscly-armed paperboy guy. I'm not sure how unique this take is, but Herbert is my family's favourite side character on the show. The way he speaks is super imitable, and I just find every appearance from him hilarious. Especially since as a British person, I'm naturally predisposed to not consider child predation to be a particularly serious issue. Anyway, let's move on to the Griffin family. Starting with the Family Guy himself, Peter Griffin. Of course, that's the big point. Back then, Peter actually was a family guy. I mean, he was still a thoughtless, inconsiderate jerk and a massive idiot, but usually he at least had some relatable motivations and generally ended up making things right eventually. Now, Lois was unambiguously a family-centered character. So many early episodes are about how much Lois does for her family and how little she is appreciated considering all she does. She's also often the moral center of the episode, and whenever she does go off the rails, it ends with some gesture of familial or romantic love that brings her back to the loving wife and mother she typically is. Lois having completely departed from this characterization in modern Family Guy is another reality so well known that it's not worth me laboring. So let's move on to the final Griffin adult, Brian. What's interesting is that in season 1, Brian doesn't get an episode that treats him at all like a character until the finale. Instead, his initial role in the show is mostly being above the narrative and commenting on it from the sidelines. He's the closest thing to a self-insert from McFarlane, and therefore this role makes sense. However, after season 1, he plays a more active role in the plot and gets more spotlight episodes. He especially carries a lot of the more emotional scenes and is written to be quite mentally complex. The biggest change to Brian's character as the show progressed was the idea he's actually a massive phony, but early on it's implied the way he presents himself is broadly accurate. Also, initially Brian and Stewie are shown to mostly hate each other, and they do throughout the early seasons, but we see them paired up often. In seasons 2 and 3 we get 2 Brian and Stewie Road to episodes. Brian and Stewie episodes are now sometimes thought of as being the best modern episodes, and the benefits of this pairing were clearly realized early on. Stewie's evil genius characterization starts off really intense. He canonically kills a guy in the 3rd episode of the show, and this was back before murderous violence was the punchline it later became. I mean, the guy was an evil cult member, but still, Stewie straight up executed him. If you actually look at some of the old Fox promos for Family Guy, they really lean into Stewie as a selling point.
America, prepare for Stewie.
Are you lost?
Now listen to me, Jolene. I've got an army to raise and I must get to Nicaragua.
A bit like how The Simpsons originally started off with Bart Mania before Homer took the spotlight. Anyway, the big question with Stewie is how gay was he early on? And the answer is not very. They have a few hints at the idea he might be gay, but they also have loads and loads of moments of him being explicitly characterized as attracted to girls.
Do her, wouldn't do her. Ugh, who hasn't done her?
Honestly, I find his later shtick of being gay for Rupert really funny.
Don't frolic too much, Rupert. Save some energy for the hula contest.
The idea of an evil genius who tries to take over the world but is also romantically involved with his own teddy bear because he's a gay baby? Come on, that's hilarious. And finally, let's talk about the last member of the Griffin family, Chris. Chris's characterization is actually really interesting in the early seasons. He's basically written to be an artistic nonconformist in most of his dialogue and storylines.
Way to go, Dad! Fight the machine!
However, he's also written to hugely admire his dad and seek out his attention and approval. He is, of course, an idiot. Possibly a bigger idiot than Peter. However, he's easily the sweetest member of the Griffin family, and Chris-centered episodes usually end up with Peter learning to appreciate his son. Overall, the early seasons have a pretty wholesome family dynamic.
Oh my god, we forgot Meg!
Alongside Joe, Meg is known for becoming a punching bag in the later seasons. Unlike Joe, however, Meg was never characterized especially favorably. As such, what made Meg different in the early seasons is slightly more subtle. One big difference is that the show was way more comfortable making her the main character. She's still regarded as unpopular and unattractive, but the show actually features stories about her struggle to make friends or connect with boys that she likes. And there are episodes where we're supposed to root for her, and everything does eventually work out in her favor. The big question is why, right from the start, was Meg so frequently the butt of jokes? I think there are a few explanations. Firstly, Meg is characterized early on as caring about her looks.
Can I please get collagen injections? Meg, you don't need to change the way you look.
This self-consciousness makes that an obvious focus for comedy. You can't really make jokes at the expense of Chris and Peter in the same way, because they just wouldn't care. Meg carries herself with a degree of dignity and is constantly talking about how her family embarrasses her. She has an ego to take down. season. This leads to the other point, that in these early seasons there are moments where Meg's family do try to accommodate her or be nice to her, and Meg is resistant to it, accusing them of embarrassing her. I only realized recently that Meg is functionally an exaggerated parody of the daughter from American Beauty, who is in turn just a representation of teenage girls more generally. Stereotypically, teenage girls are obsessed with their own image and convinced that their family are embarrassing them and ruining their lives. The way the show handles Meg is basically by cranking this up to 11. What if the way angsty teenage girls view their families was actually accurate?
Who was that guy?
That's my best explanation for how Meg came to quite immediately occupy this role as the show's punching bag. Nonetheless, Meg does have a few episodes early on where the story works out well for her, and significantly, this doesn't just function as a conspicuous subversion of her character. At the time, it wasn't impossible to imagine her actually coming out of an episode on top. Everyone talks about Flandersization, where characters become more one-dimensional and certain character traits get exaggerated over and above them being a more nuanced character. What's often ignored is the exact opposite occurring in long-running shows. If you've ever seen the Real Jim series, Simpsons Histories, you'll quickly discover that characters who made very little impact in the golden era of the show have had their backstory and personality massively expanded in later seasons. It makes sense, obviously. They're running out of ideas in the writer's room, so somebody says, let's just invent a whole new backstory for this minor character. To an extent, this has happened with Meg. You can't keep the show going forever while relegating one character to just being a loser, so they've actually given her way more to do in recent seasons. Possibly the best example of this reverse Flandersization is actually Quagmire. In the early seasons, he's very basic and almost all his jokes are about one specific thing. In later seasons, his pervertedness falls decidedly into the background in favor of a much broader characterization. This all might sound pretty good, and seeing characters evolve is a fun consequence of these shows going on so long. However, I think there's something to be said for keeping characters simple and well-defined. Most of the time, it's good for a show to know what it is. The early seasons had their own unique tone. Honestly, a surprisingly quaint tone. People often think of The Simpsons as the show with heart that's down to earth and kind of charming, in contrast to Family Guy, which is generally viewed as brutish and cynical. However, in the same year, Family Guy did episodes where Peter posed as a high school student to discourage kids from doing drugs, and Chris had to choose between pursuing his artistic ambitions or spending time with his father. The Simpsons was doing an episode where Homer gets raped by a panda. You could argue Family Guy moved into a niche that The Simpsons once filled but had since vacated. By the time Family Guy came along, The Simpsons really wasn't a family sitcom with any semblance of traditional values. Family Guy in many ways rejuvenated the presentation of those values on TV after The Simpsons abandoned them. Honestly, in some ways the fundamental worldview of Family Guy is actually less bleak than The Simpsons, even in the earlier seasons of both shows. In season 1 of The Simpsons, Marge strongly considers cheating on Homer, while in early Family Guy, Lois never comes close to that. In season 1 of The Simpsons, they have episodes where Lisa has depression and Homer tries to take his own life. In season 2, Homer literally tells Lisa he doesn't care why she's sad.
Hey, just because I don't care doesn't mean I don't understand.
Peter never expresses any equivalent sentiment. I don't think this makes Family Guy better than The Simpsons, obviously. It's actually pretty cool how real The Simpsons gets with some of these dark subjects. However, people would generally expect Family Guy to be the darker of the two shows tonally, but it really isn't. I will say that Family Guy doesn't do emotional resolutions as well as The Simpsons did. In the aforementioned episode where Homer is awful to Lisa, there's a substantial, well-paced, well-scripted scene where Homer makes it up to her and provides some closure. By contrast, there's one episode of Family Guy where Peter completely neglects Chris by mentoring Cleveland Jr. Then Jr. abandons him and Peter meets up with Chris and they just start playing golf together. There's no conversation, no real resolution. You could say it's understated, I'd call it underdeveloped. And I partially blame the cutaway format. Those cutaways take up a minute or two of every episode, a minute or two that could otherwise be dedicated to a scene that brings some of these plots to a more satisfying conclusion. Anyway, with all this talk of tone, I've kind of been implying Family Guy has no edge at all. It's generally thought of as an offensive show, but it's also worth remembering.
Why would you even say that? For shock value? Geez, Cleveland, there's edgy and there's offensive. Good day, sir.
There are offensive jokes on this show that you wouldn't see in a show like The Simpsons, but again, to the show's credit, it's not just being brazenly offensive for the sake of it. What really takes the show up a notch as an adult animated sitcom is how much sex it has in the early seasons. As I already said, they're literally watching a porno together in the first episode. Honestly, however clickbaity this thumbnail ends up being, it's because I had plenty of options from the show. I'll probably put some in because I'm a small channel and I worked really hard on this video and I want people to watch it, so boobs. Anyway, the theme tune is actually pretty accurate. I mean, this is on TV and it does have a lot of sex, but it also does have some good old-fashioned values. It didn't actually have that much violence early on. Bloody death as a punchline didn't come along until a bit later. Like The Simpsons, it had some grounded plots, mostly focused around everyday situations, but it only takes until season 2 to start getting more fantastical plots like Peter literally meeting death. We also get a non-canonical episode in season 2 without any explanation for why it's non-canonical. So while they do have these more personal stories, there isn't much suspension of disbelief to lose with this show. I mean, the baby and the dog both talk. Speaking of the baby, obviously a lot of wacky plot elements come from Stewie. Several episodes are centered around one of Stewie's schemes to take over the world, like it's Pinky and the Brain or something. It really feels like Family Guy and Futurama both did something similar in adding sci-fi elements to the animated sitcom format, but they went down different paths on that road. The obvious benefit is that you can make the show more entertaining with fantasy adventure elements rather than always having to carry the episode with the character drama alone. But the other thing that should carry an episode of Family Guy is the humor. Family Guy, I think, has a reputation for being more of a pure comedy, in contrast to a show like The Simpsons, where the plot is supposed to be just as important. Now, I'm just going to say that early Family Guy was funny. I think comedically it hit the ground running in a way that some other shows haven't. Although actually the very first joke is, in my view, not funny at all.
See, that's the worst we got is Jemima's witnesses.
This is the cold open. This is how the entire series starts, and it's not funny. And now people are going to find it even less funny because Aunt Jemima isn't a thing anymore. Although I guess we did solve racism, so that's a worthwhile trade-off. But obviously comedy is subjective, so I can only really say that there were some jokes that made me laugh, and some jokes that didn't. What I will say is that early on the show had far fewer painfully unfunny jokes. Later seasons became a lot more hit and miss in that sometimes the jokes would still be pretty good, but other times the jokes would actually make me cringe. I didn't cringe at any of the jokes early on. We do get one example of a joke that goes on too long. They just about get away with it because the joke is that it goes on too long. It's only when all the jokes start going on too long that it becomes a real problem. Thankfully, we don't get any Conway Twitty yet. I do have to talk about the cutaway jokes. It's easy to forget this format was pretty much pioneered by Family Guy, and they really commit to establishing it as part of the show's identity. In the early seasons especially, they do lots of list jokes where they have 3 cutaways one after the other. In the very first episode, for example, they just list off examples of Peter getting drunk. This does make the pacing sort of awkward, but I think it's made up for by the jokes being pretty good, and it is part of the show's unique identity. Also, a lot of the cutaways tend to be about the characters, such that the character humour is mostly on point. There definitely are plenty of jokes in the early seasons that are well constructed within the wider context of the show, instead of just being random out-of-place gags. When I came up with the idea for this video, I was originally planning on rewatching right the way to season 6 and exploring what Family Guy was like in the first 3 seasons, then exploring how it began to change in the next 3 seasons after it was revived. It didn't take me long to decide against that once I realized how many notes I had about just these 3 seasons, and I cut a lot of stuff. Just my notes alone are about twice as long as this actual script has ended up being, but I had to keep this short so I could get something out on this channel soon because I'm still a pretty small channel. If this video does well, then of course that makes it more viable for me to make longer videos more frequently, so please watch until the very end and make sure you do all the algorithm things before you leave. It would be very appreciated and would justify a follow-up video on seasons 4 to 6 at some point. If Family Guy had stayed cancelled, it would deserve to go down as an all-time great comedy series. The original 3 seasons were really good, and the perfectionist in me regrets my family's role in buying those DVDs and partially contributing to the decision to revive it. It's hard to imagine a world where Family Guy remains this short-lived TV series about well-rounded characters with actual emotional substance when you look at what it's become now. But no matter what, those early seasons back when the show was great really do make me feel lucky there was a Family Guy. Is that really how I'm going to end this? Jesus Christ.